disappeared. Who supports labor in Israel? People on the kibbutz, people in the union, but even in those, most of them have left the Labor Party. So let me introduce you to the Israeli government. And I just want to identify the most important, because each one of these has got a really critical challenge with what Israel faces, as we do. COVID, an economy that's broken right now. The deal in the coalition was that Netanyahu will serve the first 18 months, and Gantz will be the prime minister the next 18 months. Netanyahu insisted that he would have the first 18 months because when he goes to court for his trial, he'll be treated differently as prime minister than as an ex-prime minister. And so that is the agreement they made. And then there's another rotation where Netanyahu will serve another 6 and Gantz another 6. Now, most Israelis are betting that Gantz will not be prime minister in 18 months. Netanyahu is smart enough to figure out a way out, and I'll explain a little later. Gabi Ashkenazi, again, another general, will be foreign minister, is foreign minister for the first 18 months, and then he'll move into the defense ministry as the defense minister. Remember this name. I think this guy could be a future prime minister. Israel Katz is now the finance minister, and he's got a mess on his hand. The Israeli budget is blown, just like our budget in the United States is blown because of COVID, and he's got a tough job ahead of him. The health minister has also got a tough job because of COVID. What's interesting is that the health minister until recently was a guy named Yaakov Litzman, the head of the United Torah Judaism Party, an ultra-religious Ashkenaz party. He did, by most measures, a very poor job dealing with COVID. You might know that the ultra-Orthodox community in Israel took him quite a while to realize the dangers of COVID. And when they were told not to congregate in synagogues and yeshivas, they didn't stop. And many of the early deaths in Israel were ultra-Orthodox Jews, just like in New York, actually. So Yuli Edelstein is now the health minister. The education minister is another ex-general, Yoav Gallant, and this is a really critical position. It's the second most expensive ministry in Israel after the defense ministry. He has a big budget. And of course, teaching with COVID is not going to be an easy task, not in the United States, not in Israel. Amir Ohana was the justice minister the last 6 months. He was put in the justice ministry because he obeys Netanyahu 100%. And Netanyahu wanted someone in the justice ministry to support his problems. But when they developed the coalition, the blue and white folks, Gantz, would not have it. And so Amir Ohana was moved to the Interior Ministry, which is basically the police. So he now runs the police. Energy minister is important in Israel because Israel is now a fairly significant producer of gas. It sells the gas to Jordan, to Egypt. It works with Cyprus and Greece to find more gas. It's got problems with Turkey, who's trying to become the major power in the Western Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean. So this is an important position. Transportation minister in Israel has become very important. You might know that Israel is building the first subway in its history. So in 5 years, when you go to Israel, hopefully there's going to be a subway under Tel Aviv and going to the various environs of Tel Aviv. There are trains are now all over Israel. Highways are all over Israel. So this has become a very important position. This is where Israel Katz spent the last 8 years. So again, watch Israel Katz. I think he is a prime candidate to take over when Netanyahu decides to go home. The next one is the justice minister. This guy, Avi Nissenkorn, who headed the National Union until a few months ago, is now going to try to ensure that the justice process in Israel is not corrupted because of political pressures. The interior minister is the head of Shas. Yaakov Litzman has been given housing minister. The ultra-Orthodox population in Israel is exploding. And more they need housing, and they need cheap housing. And so the guy who makes the decisions for the ultra-religious parties in Israel are their senior rabbis. And the senior rabbi told Yaakov Litzman, give up the health ministry because you're giving us a bad name, but let's take on the housing ministry because we have to build houses for our people. So that's why he's there. So, as I mentioned, Netanyahu has got his position for the next 18 months. Then there's a rotation. Ashkenazi will take over defense ministry. This is one of the craziest thing that they agreed to. Gantz insisted on having as many ministers in the cabinet as Netanyahu, which meant that after rewarding everybody that you could, they needed 36 cabinet ministers. And so today it's like 18 and 18, and it is the largest cabinet in the history of Israel, on top of which there are 16 vice ministers. It allows every party to give out jobs. It's going to cost $200 million a year. And this is done when 1 million Israelis are unemployed because of the shutting down of the economy. It's amazing. There's lots of anger in Israel for that. The head of the Knesset opposition, who does have some benefits, is now Yair Lapid, because his 16 members allow him to be the leader of the largest opposition party, larger than the Arab list. The question is, why did Gantz enter a coalition and with Netanyahu after all those promises? And Gantz was very popular in Israel because lots of politicians are viewed as a little bit crooked, not always honest. Gantz had a tremendous clean reputation. Why did he risk that reputation? So there's some various reasons. Obviously, he viewed this as a way of becoming prime minister in 18 months. He also, as I said before, he realized a fourth election with Corona doesn't make sense, and it probably won't resolve the problem. He still won't get enough seats in Knesset. You can also argue that he did it as an Israeli patriot. Besides dealing with the Corona, he knew that Israel needed a stable government. All these months with no government, Israel was run by Netanyahu and a cabinet from the old coalition that couldn't, by law, make major decisions. And so Israel for 12 plus months was not making decisions that needed to be made for the current and the future. And so he broke that logjam. And finally, he truly wanted to make sure that there was someone there in the coalition who could rival Netanyahu if Netanyahu wanted to do some things. All right, before we talk about Netanyahu's indictment, any questions or comments? All right. So now Israel has a government, but the job that the government has to do isn't just complicated by COVID and a broken economy. It's also going to be interrupted by Netanyahu's indictment. What's interesting here is that Netanyahu has a history on reacting to prime ministers who are in trouble with the law. His predecessor was also on the way to an indictment, wasn't indicted yet, and Netanyahu was all over television basically saying, if you've been accused by the police and you might be indicted, you need to step down. Here, he was actually indicted, and still would not step down. He has the loyalty of his party, which basically allows him to take that position. But he was charged with fraud and the breach of trust. And so let me tell you what he's charged with. There are 4 cases, 3 of which he has been found to have enough evidence to take him to trial. Case 1,000, he accepted 700,000 Israeli shekel, which is about $200,000, in the form of gifts, cigars, and champagne bottles for a long period of time from two billionaires, an American Israeli named Arnold Milchan, an Australian named James Packer, in return for favors. The argument is that the favors weren't really significant, but nevertheless, the prosecution believes they can prove this case. The second is that he made a deal with the most important newspaper in Israel, Yediot Ahronot, and its owner, that if the Yediot Ahronot is to treat him better, he will do something for them vis-a-vis the number 1 paper in Israel. The number 1 paper in Israel is Harashot Hayom, today's news. It was created, established by Sheldon Adelson, who is a big supporter of Netanyahu. And he did it so Netanyahu could get decent publicity. But it was sold it was a free paper. So very quickly it became the number 1 seller, if you will. And Netanyahu basically was ready to put in a law that says you can't sell for free, which would make Yediot Ahronot's financials better. It never happened, but there are conversations that have been recorded, and Netanyahu is up for that. The most significant issue is case 4,000. Case 4,000 basically says that Netanyahu provided regulatory favors to one of the larger companies in Israel, Bezeq Telecommunications, which was worth over $1 billion shekel to that company. In return, the owner of Bezeq Telecommunications was going to provide favorable treatment through his online news channel, Walla. Again, there are recordings. The prosecution believes that they can favorably prosecute this. What Netanyahu did was very interesting. In his prior government, he decided to remove the communications minister, Gilad Erdan, who was one of the favorites ultimately to take over for him. He moved him out of the telecommunications ministry to take over the police. And he took over the telecommunication ministry as the prime minister. He held both jobs. He fired the chief of staff of that ministry, put in his own guy, and then had his own guy create those regulatory favors. That chief of staff is now a witness for the prosecution. And so this is the worst of the 3 offenses. And for this, he can go to jail if he gets prosecuted. The trial will start in 6 months. In fact, on the first bullet point, on May 27th, after 2 weeks of lots of arguments, Netanyahu appeared in court. He didn't want to appear in court. He didn't want that picture to be shown. And he was indicted, as every Israeli is, in court, as opposed to just having his lawyers be there. The thing is that the decision will take another 1.5 years or 2 after the trial. So this isn't going to really be finalized till the end of this government, likely. But this is one of the several reasons why there are quite a few people who believe this will be Netanyahu's last chance at prime ministership. So Any questions, comments before we go on to discuss COVID? Okay. It's difficult for me not to compare the Israeli experience with our experience vis-a-vis COVID. To date, Israel has lost about 320 people. Again, just like in the United States, many of them are older with underlying conditions. Many of them were in senior citizens' homes, and both the United States and Israel just were not ready to protect that population in senior citizens' homes. The fact is that until about 2 weeks ago, the Israel experience was one of the best in the world. And just think about 320 deaths for a country that has the population of New Jersey. Actually, even the territory, the square footage is a little bit similar. New Jersey's had over 15,000 deaths. True, New Jersey's the second worst experience in the United States, but nevertheless, Israel's experience so far has been fairly good. There are no more than 50 people hospitalized, and there are only about 20, 30 people on ventilators. There are about 24, 25,000 cases as of yesterday. There are about 1 million tests having been done. And at one point, when Israel was at the top of its first wave, and I'll talk about the second wave in a second, Israel had the third most tests per million population in the world, at the time when the United States was around 30th. Even though we, the United States, had the most tests in the world even back then, we're 350 million people. We're the largest after China, India, and Indonesia. So when you look at per million, we didn't do so well. Israel was on top of it, and as a result, when the first wave started dying out, Israel was really in a great situation. They cut off flights immediately from Europe, and that was the biggest thing they could do. They delayed cutting the United States travel into Israel. Unfortunately, it was a political decision. The Israeli government did not want to upset Trump, but they finally did that as well. And so that was a big deal. Israelis who were returning on special flights to get back home were forced to isolate for 14 days. And then, again, I mentioned lots of testing. Unessential businesses, public transportation, prayer houses, schools, all were closed for about 4 weeks. If you weren't in an essential business, you had to stay home. The law was you could go up to 100 meters away from your home. You could go to the grocery or to the pharmacy, but otherwise you had to stay at home. And you were given tickets if you disobeyed. And then what Israel did is identified where there were clusters. And there were serious clusters in Jerusalem and Bnei Brak, the ultra-Orthodox communities, and they closed those. If you didn't live there, you couldn't go in there. And if you lived there, you couldn't go out, unless, again, you had a critical position to fill. And on top of that, Israel did something that we would never do. Privacy in Israel is important, but nothing compared to privacy in the United States, which is protected by various laws. In Israel, they gave the Shin Bet, which is the equivalent of the FBI, the authority to trace people who should be in isolation. And if you left home, Shin Bet would know about it. I don't know if you've seen the graphs of Florida. We also, for a little while, stayed home, but very, very quickly, because even in the United States, the companies that give us the various cell phone services can give the government a perspective of how many people have left home and went back to their normal lives. They can't do that on an individual basis or identify an individual because of privacy laws, but they could show us that we in Florida decided to abandon this whole thing very, very quickly, which is why we're seeing what's happening in Florida right now. The Knesset is now passing a law that gives Shin Bet this authority again. What were the results in Israel of locking down the economy? Almost immediately, 1 million people lost their jobs. In Israel, that's 25% unemployment. The government set up a plan for 80 billion Israeli shekels, about 25 billion dollars. And of course, government revenue, just like here, disappeared. Tourism died and all that. A lot of industries that generate taxes for government revenues no longer functioned. The budget in Israel is blown. A country that focuses on not overspending spends 3% over their taxes, meaning they'll overspend, but only 3%. In Israel, this year it'll be 11%. As we know, in the United States, it'll also be a big number. The one positive thing that came out of all of this is that the army was brought in to help with distribution of food, with creation of roadblocks if they were closing a city. And it was amazing how the army went into Bnei Brak and gave food to ultra-Orthodox families. And you could see ultra-Orthodox people who hate the army for various reasons start realizing, hey, these are Jews and they're helping us. There's also quite a bit of cooperation between the Arab population and the Israeli population and the Israeli army, another area where they're not too much liked. So who knows, maybe this will be the start of something positive. The country returned to normal. There were some restrictions still. Tourism is still not open. Hotels, leisure you still can't have concerts or theater with more than a few people. They started returning to it. By the way, in Israel, masks are required. If you're caught without a mask, you can get a fine, and many do. But unfortunately, after a phenomenal performance in May, in June, the infestation started again, and Israel now is in the 500, 600, 700. I think yesterday or today, 700 people were new cases. So this could very well be the second wave for Israel. When the schools, by the way, opened, they all went back, but then they started closing as kids got sick, and now, thankfully, they're all out to the summer break. Many small businesses are in trouble, and here's Israel's experience. As you could see, in March, it went up very quickly. Israel put its foot down, the government, people stayed home, it went down, and look at this. In May, most days were 10, 20 or less. And only since June has it started going back up. And of course, this is our experience in Florida right now, except in Florida, it's the trajectory is much steeper. Any questions on COVID? Just one thing, Europe has just announced that I think 11 or 14 countries are allowed to send tourists back to Europe. Europe is opening up. The United States and we as potential tourists are not allowed to fly to Europe because of our experience. Until 2 weeks ago, Israel was on that list. Cyprus and Greece were working with the Israeli government to allow them to come in. But Israel, with its current experience, has also been left off of the list. All right, let's talk about the peace deal. Uh, the deal, from one perspective, may have some merits. For 50 years, the Israelis and the Palestinians have talked and not talked and didn't get anywhere. And over the last 10 years, it was clear Netanyahu really didn't have much interest in negotiations, neither did Mahmoud Abbas. And so nothing was happening over a long period of time. President Trump figured, you know what? I'm going to give them a peace plan as a fait accompli. Take it or leave it. And maybe that'll break the ice. And so I'm going to take you through the terms. And then next week we'll discuss what's happened. And the reason this is very timely is that Netanyahu agreed with the Trump administration that he will not do anything on this front until at least July 1st. That's tomorrow. It wouldn't surprise me if some announcement is made over the next week, even if no action is taken over the next week. So when we come back next week, we may be talking about something that happened. But at any rate, the peace plan allows Israel to retain 30% of the West Bank. That's a gigantic number. Even when the Arabs and the Palestinians and Israel were close under the prior government, Israel was going to retain something like 8-9% of the West Bank. 30% is, I mean, when the Palestinians saw that, that killed it from their perspective. 20% of the 30% is the Jordan Valley. The Jordan Valley is the territory along the Jordan River, which is on the west side of Yehuda v'Shomron, the West Bank, and it's got very little population. It's got Israeli settlers. The city of Jericho is just outside of it. That's much of it. And Israel believes it needs that because, God forbid, Iran somehow gets into Iraq and Jordan, it's right next to Israel. And Israel wants to be able to defend itself, not in Petah Tikva or Tel Aviv, but on the West Bank. They would also annex all of the settlements. And so that's about 10% of the West Bank. So net 30%. The Palestinians would keep 70% of it, and they would be given, and I'll show you a map later, they'll be given enclaves in the Negev along the Egyptian border that would compensate for the loss of territory. A road would be constructed from the West Bank straight to the Gaza Strip, which would allow Arab traffic, and I believe only Arab traffic, so that there'd be a union between the two sections. Israel will maintain control of all the borders that it currently has, even when it gives up the 70%. Here's one that the Palestinians would have a tough time chewing. They have to recognize Israel as the Jewish homeland. That is something they have never agreed to. In fact, even the Arab population in Israel, Israeli citizens, don't agree on this, at least most of them. With regard to Jerusalem, Jerusalem will be kept united as Israel's capital. As you know, the Palestinians want East Jerusalem, the old city, to be their capital. Now, I'll show you a map in a few minutes, which will show you the suburbs or the environs of the city of Jerusalem. And the suggestion is that some of those territories will be developed and become the capital of Palestine. Today, most of those neighborhoods are outside of the wall, of the security wall that Israel built to separate itself from the West Bank. Again, Israel will retain all the Jordan River, all the settlements, And there are about 15 settlements that are inside heavily Arab territories. Well, even though they're isolated, a road will be built. That road will only be traveled by people from the settlers, from the settlements, allowing them continuity into Israel. Israel will not build in the isolated settlements for the next 4 years, which of course the settlers are having a tough time agreeing to. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, will have access to those settlements. And this basically, Trump had to include it because Israel said, we are not going to break up settlements in Yehuda Shomron as we did in Gaza. Israel will take sovereignty over all the settlements. What that means, today, Israelis living in Yehuda Shomron, West Bank, are Israeli citizens and they live under Israeli law. But the land itself is militarily occupied. So, for instance, without sovereignty, Israel cannot use habeas corpus where they would take land for the public good. If it's owned by a Palestinian, Israelis cannot build on it. It's been a big problem for many years because Israelis do take and build on it. Israel will control all the space from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean for security purposes, and the IDF will remain in the West Bank and most specifically the Jordan River. The West Bank will be demilitarized. The United States will provide economic aid to this new country, but most of the money will come from Saudi Arabia and the Gulf states. Now, the Palestinian state, Israel would have to agree that at the end of the road, if the Palestinians honor all the requirements under this deal, Israel will have to create the pathway to statehood for the Palestinians. Again, it'll cover 70% of the West Bank. It'll cover areas A and B. Areas A is where heavy population, the cities are, and the Palestinian state, the Palestinian Authority, controls everything except for security. In B, they control education, health, and the economy. Israel controls a good part of C with the military. And C, again, is the Jordan Valley, the settlements, and the Judean desert. Again, in 4 years, as long as the Palestinians accept and perform, they will have a state of their own. The Palestinian Authority will stop paying terrorists and their families. You may know that if a terrorist is captured and sent to prison, the Palestinian Authority pays his family. And that has been a thorn in Israel's throat. Here's a tough one. Hamas and Islamic Jihad, which are truly not controlled by the Palestinian Authority, will have to put down their arms. I suspect even if the Palestinian Authority agreed to everything else, this won't happen. The Palestinians will have to give up corruption, they have to respect human rights, and provide freedom of religion and free press. So there's an effort here to turn them into a democracy. The United States will recognize the Palestinian state once all the conditions are met. And again, it'll provide them economic assistance. Refugees, the Palestinians have always argued for right of return. And although they realize in conversation and discussions that they're not going to be able to come back home to the Israel of 1967, they would argue that some would be allowed to do that. Here, what is being said is the Palestinian diaspora cannot all come back to the new Palestine. Some will be allowed to, but not most, which would be difficult. If, as a Jew, I can go back to Israel. As a Jew, you could go to Israel and become an Israel citizen. That will not be afforded the Palestinian diaspora. and none of them will return to Israel, the Israel of today or tomorrow. Interesting, this was included, the possibility of swapping areas within Israel as compensation. If you look along the old green line, which is the border up to 1967, there are two areas especially that have lots of Arab villages, especially one in the lower Galilee, next to the border with West Bank, a city called El Pachem. It is either the largest or the second largest Arab city after Nazareth. The idea was to draw borders and include El Pachem in the Palestinian state, as well as some of, it's called the Mishulash, the triangle. Again, Arab villages along Israel's, in fact, right in Israel's neck. The bottom line was Israeli Arabs started complaining. They want to see a Palestine. They want to see an Israel that is not a Jewish country, that is a multi-ethnic country. But they do not want to live in an Arab country. They see what they can accomplish in Israel. They don't want to live under an Arab administration. I find that very interesting. So here is what it looks like. This is the West Bank. You could see the Jordan River flowing into the Dead Sea. This whole area is the Jordan Valley. There are about 6,000 Israelis living there. There really aren't towns. They have large farms, ranches, agriculture is big, nothing big in terms of settlements, but all this area is easy to annex because no Israeli Jew wants to bring large numbers of Arabs to become citizens of Israel. So this could be a clean annexation if we didn't have opposition. There are also around Jerusalem a couple 100,000 settlers. We call them, they're called settlers only because they live on the other side of the old border, but they live right next to Jerusalem. Their lives are intertwined with Jerusalem. Then there are a couple of big cities, one here, Betar, Modi'in Elite, and down here, Betar, can't remember the full name, two cities with about 120,000 settlers that are ultra-Orthodox. And to annex them would be fairly easy. They're right on the border. So net, there are ways to do this cleanly, but not with all the settlements. As you could see, there's settlements in the middle of very heavy populated Palestinian areas. That's difficult. Also, there's a city called Ma'aleh Adumim. It is somewhere here, and you have to allow this city of about 60,000 people to have straight access to Jerusalem. So look what happens. The Palestinian state is cut into two. One of their issues. Here's the road to Gaza, and here are the two areas in the Negev, which have either no population or minimal population, Jewish population, and they will become part of Palestine. There'll be a road, there already is a road, but an improved road that brings them into Gaza. They will have shipping rights, trade rights out of Ashdod and Haifa, and that is the plan that has been offered. This is the West Bank. Again, Modi'in Elite is the city I mentioned. Betar Elite is somewhere here. This is the most important city, Ramallah, which is only about 10, 12 miles away from Jerusalem. That's where their government is. Of course, Hebron is, I think, the largest populated city for them, and it's a holy site for them as well. Abraham is important to us. He's important to them as well. So, as you could see, the Arab population is, and Arab control is over the brown, and Area C is all the blue, and 30%, which is less than all the blue, will ultimately become Israel if this plan works. And this is the map of Jerusalem. This is the city of Jerusalem, and these are its neighborhoods, its environs. And if you look at it, the red areas are Jewish towns, a couple of 100,000 Jews. I have a couple of first cousins living there. And the dark green, I guess that's dark green, are Arab villages. And much of the terrorism in the early 2000s that came into Jerusalem, they bombed buses and restaurants, came from these villages. So again, I'm not exactly sure where Abu Dus is. It's a neighborhood that is meant to be turned into the capital of the Palestinian people. They have no interest in it. And so that is the deal. What's interesting, what I find very interesting, is that a couple of days ago, Mahmoud Abbas, the leader of the Palestinian Authority, sent a letter to the 4 European powers. He doesn't talk to the United States these days because of Trump and what Trump has done over the last year. He went to France, Germany, Britain, and maybe Italy, or Germany. And he basically, in a letter, recommended that he and Netanyahu start talks. Now, it's been around for years, and he refused to get into talks without preconditions. So maybe this whole thing will get the two sides together. But a perspective I have is it's too late, Mahmoud Abbas. The Israeli government is concerned that Trump will lose the next election. And so between April 1st and November, end of October, if you will, whatever Israel is going to do, it will do at that time. Because if a Biden wins, Israel will no longer have the support to annex any territory. So we're going to see stuff happening. You should know that Gantz entered this coalition without veto power over this annexation. Netanyahu promised him a conversation. They can have a discussion. But he will not be able to veto this plan. We'll talk about the plan, what I think, my perspective of the pros, my perspective of the cons, and what potential implications it might have for Israel. And I'm sure that Mossad and Shin Bet and the army have studied all of this to the extent that they know, because frankly, these plans only very, very recently have been presented to these three institutions, and they'll have perspectives on and recommendations. We could talk about that next week. If you have any questions, comments, I'm very willing, interested to hear.
Ephraim.
Henry, you are muted.
Ephraim, take off your screen.
I unmuted me. Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, Henry.
Okay.
Before you ask the question, do I stop share?
Yes.
Take this. Okay.
There you
All
go.
right. Oh, thank you.
All right. So Ephraim, what you said is so true, that they have to do something, because no matter what the election, if the other party gets in, they were already saying, stop helping Israel. A couple of their candidates, a couple of their people already in the Congress on the other side, on the Democratic side, that there's too much given to Israel. So I would bet anything. I'll bet any of you people online there that they're going to do something, because
Henry,
otherwise, no matter what happens, they're going to get held up. I mean, it's scary.
Henry, let me just say a couple of things. You and I have had these conversations before, after Sunday's minion and things of that sort. First of all, the Democratic Party at this stage is very pro-Israel. There are 5, they all happen to be women, but there are 5 women who are in Congress who are very anti-Israel. A couple of them may even be anti-Semitic. But what you said is right, is that the Democratic leadership, and it's not just Obama, who is one of the least liked presidents in Israel and in history, but anyone who will represent the Democrats in the White House will likely not have the authority to do what Trump wants to do. I'm not trying to compliment Trump. I'm just saying the way I see it. So if I were a settler, or if I was on the right wanting to see this happen, or even on the left wanting to see it happen, there are 3-4 months to do it in, based on polls. Now, polls can change, but the bottom line is, you're right, the window is narrow. And Israel's government has a majority for this. A good part of the people in blue and white will go along with it. The major difference between Netanyahu and blue and white, I think blue and white will vote for annexation, but not for areas with lots of Arabs. They do not, and the question, we can have a discussion next week. Can Israel be a Jewish country and absorb 2 million Arabs? That's now, that's not the scenario that's necessarily going to happen. But if it does happen, Israel a democracy? Israel a Jewish country? Can it be both? I don't have an answer. Anybody else?
Sylvia, unmute yourself.
Sylvia, do you want to?
I have a question about how has the COVID affected the Arab territories?
You know, it's interesting, and it's not just with the Arab territories. We look at Western Europe, we look at the United States and South America, and we're all suffering like crazy. And the question is, have we handled it right? But bottom line is, you go to some countries that are much less developed, like Jordan. Jordan should suffer, even if they manage it well, and they have managed it well, they should suffer at least like Israel. They've had a better experience than Israel. The Palestinian territories, interestingly enough, has not had lots of illnesses, although this second wave may change that. But most of their illnesses came from workers, their workers who go into Israel and bring it back to their territory. So it's interesting why some countries have been hit hard, some countries haven't. In Asia, I think we know. Many Asian countries managed this much better than we, and they've had pretty good experience as a result. Even if they have had, like Korea, a small second wave, South Korea.
Thank you.
Anybody else?
Yes, you said something, but I think I must have misunderstood. You said something that the Palestinians wouldn't want an Arab government.
They don't see it.
The Arabs in Israel,
They see this.
if they were given a choice, if they lived near the old 1967 border, where they could easily be incorporated into Palestine by Israel giving up a little bit of territory, and they would become Palestinian citizens. Listen, Arabs under the law have equal rights as Jews, but in reality they don't. And some good reasons, some very terrible reasons. Racism is a terrible reason. They don't serve in the army. So there are some jobs they're never going to get. You can call it inequality, but you know, there's a responsibility to protect the country, and they don't have to serve. They can volunteer, but they're not drafted. So you would expect, perhaps, that someone who lives a stone's throw away from the old border to be willing to be cut out so that it can be part of an Arab country, a country with Palestinians as a majority. But most Arabs would never want that because relative to the neighbors, they live very well in Israel. And they see what happens in Egypt, and they see what happens in Jordan, and in Syria, and in Lebanon, and Iraq. They want to stay in Israel.
Ephraim, what about the king of Jordan? He's not happy with the proposed plan. What effect does he have on it, or what will
Well,
he add to it?
I'm going to ask you to wait till next week, but I will say this. There's only one country that's happy with this, two countries that are happy with this. Israel, part of Israel, majority in Israel, and the United States. I don't think you could find a third country that will stand up and say this is a good deal. You know, when Israel loses big in the United Nations, the Marshall Islands and 2 or 3 other Pacific islands vote with the United States and Israel in favor of Israel. Israel has wonderful diplomatic relations with lots of countries, lots of trade, lots of educational exchanges. But when it comes to diplomacy, and Israel is 1 vote against 50, 60 Muslim countries and 60 votes, Israel is a very tough time with it. So if Israel annexes, you will hear lots of noise. It may only be noise, which is the argument on the right. On the left, you will hear lots of reasons why it shouldn't be done. We'll talk about that next week.
On behalf of,
Rena had her hand up, Ephraim.
Yeah,
Rena, you're muted.
you're
You're
muted.
muted, Rena.
Mitch, can you unmute her?
Yeah, I will. Well, she has to unmute herself.
Yeah, unable to, I'm unable
I'm
to
on-
mute her.
Yeah.
Okay,
Nice job, Ephraim.
thank you.
all right, on behalf,
There she is. She's
Oh.
unmuted.
Okay.
Yeah, I understand that in Israel, the settlers are not very happy with the whole plan. How
Right.
do you explain it?
I'll
It's the
answer
settlers
it.
that don't like it.
I'll answer it, although it really is a discussion for next week. The settlers want annexation. They want annexation of the entire area. But what they don't like is the fact that this deal isn't just, this is the stuff that Israelis would like. There's also a Palestinian country down the road. And they do not want to tempt the world to work with the Palestinians to get them into a position to have their own country.
Okay, and one more question. Annexation means that the areas, the people who live in the areas that are going to be annexed are going to be Israeli citizens, and they will have the right to vote. Right now, 20% of the Israeli population is Arabs. It's going to make it much more than 20%. How can you keep it a Jewish state while being a democracy?
That's the challenge, and that's why the
It-
position
It
that blue
looks
and white.
like.
Go ahead.
Mhm.
Go ahead, Rena. Finish.
That's all.
Oh, well, that's why blue and white, which represents a much more moderate and leftist voter group, says we're not totally against annexation. We don't want to annex areas that will bring with them lots of Arabs, which is why when Jerusalem was annexed, the neighborhoods weren't annexed because there are 300,000 Arabs in the neighborhoods that Israel did not want to incorporate as Israeli citizens. The word apartheid is in the air because there are some thoughts that bring the territory, bring the Arabs, but don't give them voting rights. So that's a concern on the part of people who don't want to be accused as being an apartheid state. Again, next week I will present the argument from the right, the argument from the left. As a Jew who wants to see Eretz Israel as part of Israel, I lean one way. As someone who wants Israel to be democratic and Jewish, I lean the other way. So I can't say that I'm not troubled. Okay, anything else?
Yashikoa.
Thank you.
Thank you, Ephraim. Good
you.
job.
Great job.
On behalf of Adult Ed, Cindy and I would like to thank Ephraim for such a great program. Our second and final session will be in 1 week, Tuesday, July 7th, 8 o'clock at the end of Minion. Thanks a lot, everybody.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. It was
Ephraim,
excellent, Brian.
Ephraim.
Thank you.
Hey, Ephraim,
Good job.
Ephraim,
Yes,
what'd you think of that course on the, that Matt King gave?
wonderful.
Wasn't it terrific, wasn't it? You know what? I never thought, people don't realize how many Jews were killed during the Middle Ages in those crusades and everything. Unbelievable.
Yep.
He was terrific. Well, you did a great job. Thank you very much.
All
Great
right.
job.
Thank you
Bye-bye.
and take care. See you next week.
Thank you. I'll see
you next
week, Ephraim.
All
Good
right.
job, Ephraim.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye. So Mitch,
Hold on, Sharon.
okay.